welcome to another Culture Chat at Lunch. My name is Jeremy Neal Blowers. I'm the Executive Director at the Ontario Regiment Museum in Oshawa, at the Oshawa Airport South Field. I'm not the curator, I'm not the regimental historian, but I will try to answer all your questions at the end of the presentation as best as I can. We're super excited to be part of this series. It's a collaboration between our museum, the Oshawa Museum, Oshawa Public Libraries, Parkwood Estate, the RMG, and the Canadian Automotive Museum. So we've been actively engaged in the community in our own right with some virtual programming and videos through the pandemic. But this is an opportunity. This series is for us all to collaborate and share stories, with a new audience, and also, give a talk that's accessible and supports connection and well-being in our community during this very, very difficult time. So we're located in the city of Oshawa, but our museum represents the Ontario Regiment, which is the military unit for the region of Durham. And we recognize that Oshawa is located on the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Scugog Island Nation and the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Anishinaabe. Today, our Indigenous communities continue to contribute to the life of this city and region and to celebrate their heritage, practice traditions, and care for the land and waterways as sacred. That's a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today and about our museum. Some people are confused. They call us the Tank Museum. We're known, not only here in Oshawa and throughout the country and around the world as an active military vehicle museum, but we are actually the Canadian Armed Forces accredited regimental museum of the Ontario Regiment RCAC. So it's not just tanks and vehicles you'll see when you get up here. We actually have a static display museum. We have an archive. We do a lot of research in our community in military matters, both of the Ontario Regiment and other things such as the Second World War, the Commonwealth Air Training Program at the airport. So we're going to not be talking about tanks today. We're going to be talking about the early militia. I'll just share my screen here. Okay, I hope you guys can all see that. So most of what I'm going to be talking about today is the first part of the continuing series that I'll be giving when it's our slot in Culture Chats at Lunch. And most of the content comes from our regimental history, Fidelis Apparatus. It's a history of the Ontario Regiment from 1866 to 2016. It's 150 years of regimental history. It's available in the museum gift shop, on the online gift shop at the Ontario Regiment Museum, and also in the online bookshop of the Oshawa Museum. So if you really like some of this content, you want to learn more, you want to dig deeper into it, we highly recommend that you pick up Fidelis Apparatus. But what I'm talking about today is going to take us into some really early history, long before the Ontario Regiment. The early militia in Ontario County, which is now the region of Durham, and the development that led to the creation of the Ontario Regiment as we know it today. So we're going to go back in history over 200 years. And, really to set the scene for this, we live here in Oshawa, quite an affluent city, very safe. Canada, we're isolated from the rest of the world on a continent with our largest ally, the United States. People do not carry weapons. We seem very safe, but we seem to forget that, this was a dangerous continent 200 years ago. And, the people who lived in Upper and Lower Canada were constantly at threat of invasion, rebellion, pirates, yes, even pirates and thieves on the Great Lakes and through the water waves. And as part of the British Empire, the the British, it was in geopolitical matters, you know, when things were going on in the world, it was affecting us here in Ontario County. And you'll notice that in our history from what I'm going to talk about right to today, that, you know, the interest in military affairs and military service sort of ebbs and flows through the decades, over the centuries, as threats are presented to us, and then in times of peace. So what we're looking at here is it's a drawing from 1790, and this is the annual muster on the King's birthday right here in Canada. So you can see that there is a military officer, and he has a few sergeants there, and then you see looks a bit like a rabble, civilians in their regular clothing, some with a musket, some with pitchforks and spears, even shovels. And this was something that if you lived here at that period over 200 years ago, this would have been your responsibility as a male once a year. You know, the British Empire, including Upper and Lower Canada, were defended by British regulars, you know, still as part of the British Empire. It wasn't the Canadian military. But there was universal service for every male Canadian. So you weren't part of the armed forces, the official armed forces, but you were required to provide universal service for the defense of your home and the defense of Canada. And these were called local militias. So what would happen at the annual muster, it usually was on the King's birthday, is that you would gather up and form up in your, you know, in your town or in your county, and you would have your names taken, your names, your age, your address, a little bit of a military census there. And you would have to be put on a roll so that you could be called out if there was some sort of emergency. You have to remember at this time, North America, there was the American Revolutionary War, there was conflicts with Spain and with Mexico. There was, you know, years of the so-called Indian Wars in the United States, colonial powers vying for position and to undermine each other in British North America when there was conflicts in Europe. And, you know, Britain really didn't have the funding to have a large military force here unless there was an emergency. So the lieutenant governor would appoint a county lieutenant, and then they would appoint local militia officers. So even in this early time, you can see that there definitely is, you know, a strong class structure in that, because obviously the lieutenant governor is going to appoint local judges, well-connected people, wealthy industrialists, etc., to be the lieutenant in their county. And, you know, sadly, what sometimes could happen also is that as for the officers of the militia units, they would appoint their friends because they were trusted individuals or employees. So it was really decentralized in that the lieutenant governor gave this power to raise these militias and manage these militias to the county lieutenants. And as for the, you know, the citizens or ancestors here that were having to muster on the muster day, they had to provide their own weapon. They were not provided with any uniforms. And in most cases, they were not provided with any training whatsoever. So it was really just to get that nominal roll so that if there was an emergency, that the population could be called on. And over time, Parade Day is the King's birthday. It ended up being a big social event. So yes, you would come out, you would show that you would form up, as you can see these silly citizen soldiers here. But then it would turn into a bit of a festival. There'd be a lot of you know, drinking going on at local taverns. It was a day to be out, a day to connect with people who had come from other communities that you had not seen since the last muster. And it was definitely part of the social fabric if you were a male in Upper Canada at that time. So also at this time, there was no regiment that was here in Ontario County. And the militia unit that was raised here was actually considered the Eastern York Militia, part of the Eastern York Militia. So remember, Toronto was York at that time. So there wasn't really an identity for the military unit that was here at that time. And we talk about these conflicts that would be rising up and down, throughout the county. And this led to the Militia Act of 1808. And that meant that all males aged 16 to 60 had to register for this annual muster. And also they changed the law so that you could be called out at any time. Now there was a lot of tension here, some tension growing from the United States after the Revolutionary War. And as we now know, leading into the War of 1812, there was some real threats to British North America from the other people that we're sharing the continent with. So, but still, you had to provide your own weapon and supplies. And this is much different from the earlier militia, because now, and we're living in a society now where people don't have firearms, but this is interesting. You look at the act here. The act specified that once enrolled, each man had 6 months in which to provide himself, quote, with a good and sufficient musket, fusil, rifle, or gun, with at least 6 rounds of powder and ball, and shall be called out either for the purpose of review, exercise, or actual service. Fines will be levied for failing to appear with a weapon. So quite literally, they wanted to arm the populace so that they could be used as this emergency militia. And you could receive a fine of 5 shillings during peacetime and up to 40 shillings in a time of war if you did not show up with a muster with 6 rounds of ammunition and your musket or rifle. So, quite a difference from today. And also you can see that this wasn't voluntary. This was everybody, had to be involved in that. So, we get to the crisis of the War of 1812, and that's what I have here. This is actually the Battle of York. And you can see that there's the American flotilla there. They're actually attacking and bombarding what is now Toronto. And during that time, some of these volunteers were called up. Several companies were raised in what is now Durham Region for the York Regiment. And they served, throughout the conflict. Some of them in the Battle of Queenston Heights. They went to border regions for guard duty during the War of 1812. And they were just citizens that were pulled, from their homes, some of them reluctantly, and many of them were volunteers, and had to serve during this conflict. And, in this talk, I'm really talking about what it was like to be a part of that militia, and what led people to being in that militia. I'm not going to be talking about generals and battles and all that kind of stuff you'd expect in military history. But one thing that you probably don't know, and you've never heard of in the War of 1812, is the Battle of Whitby. That's right, Whitby, Ontario. In 1812, an American gunboat attacked British supply ships that were heading for York. And these ships were very lightly armed. They were no match for this American gunboat. And so they pulled ashore in Whitby, very close to the current where Whitby Harbor is. You can imagine this is someplace that you guys see often. And it's hard to imagine that there was an actual battle that took place in 1812. So they pulled their boats into shore to try to get away from the American gunboats. The Americans wanted to either destroy or capture all the supplies and goods that were going to York. So they pulled their boats into shore to try to get away from the gunboat, and then started engaging the gunboat and the Marines that were attacking. Many of the Marines, the American Marines, actually got on shore in Whitby. So this is an actual, not just a naval battle engagement, this is a battle at Whitby Harbor in 1812. And what's amazing is because of that Militia Act, many of the locals in Whitby, they actually raised their arms and helped the British flotilla by defending the boats and firing back at the Americans. And this went on throughout the night. So you had, the local militia that was raised. They weren't called out. They just saw that there was an attack, and they went to the shore of Whitby, actually from Oshawa to Pickering, and we're waiting for these Marines to land, and at times engaging and firing back with these Marines. The American gunboat eventually moved off, gave up on the fight, and continued all night to bombard the shores of Whitby all the way out to Pickering. So imagine that. In today's day and age, it's hard to imagine a naval battle and a land battle like that right on our shores, but it happened. And it just sort of reinforced why the British Empire really wanted to train and arm a local militia. So I said earlier that, you know, the interest in military affairs sort of ebbs. After the War of 1812, there was less of an interest in joining the militia and military affairs. That's right, I think I messed up my share there. And the annual muster continued, but it lacked all funding and it wasn't really important to the government anymore. So after a time, it really became a joke in the mid-19th century. And people still came out. It ended up being a pub day and a pub night. They still liked that social aspect of getting out and mustering and seeing people from other communities. But you know, without any funding, there's not even written about very much from that part of the 19th century about what was happening with the local militia. Now there was rebellions like the 1837 rebellion in Toronto, where some of that militia were called out and they had to go and serve, even involved in a few skirmishes. And some called for guard duty around the time of the American Civil War. There was a lot of fear of that Canada might get involved or Britain might get involved, and that there might be some incursions into Canada. But during that, you know, that time also, the British and the British Empire started to get into some other global conflicts, and that's what I mean by, you know, things happening geopolitically around the world, even at this time, affecting what was happening here in Durham region. And that led to the Militia Act of 1855, and this one's pretty key, because the British really had to withdraw from Canada, their military, the Redcoats, their forces, due to the Crimean War, and it was time for Canada to provide for its own defense, not just the pitchfork militia, but to actually be ready to defend the country and the regions on our own. So with the Militia Act of 1855, they actually put into law that there would be a training day. So not just a muster day, but all the male citizens 16 to 60 would have to come out for a training day. They would be issue weapons on those training days, and in some cases, they received uniforms. So the uniforms didn't come from the government; they usually came from you know, the wealthy colonels that were appointed by the lieutenant governor because they wanted their militia, you know, to look proper. So they also broke it into two types of militia. There was the sedentary militia, which was everybody has to be called out for that training day. And then there was an active militia. So here we actually start to see the early formation and organization of what would later become the Ontario Regiment. So the active militia were volunteers. They actually volunteered. They would train for 6 consecutive days. They would receive uniforms. They would be paid for those 6 days. And they often, including in Ontario County here, and here's a map of Ontario County at the time, they would concentrate in certain areas, like in Cannington, etc., all the different small groups from the townships, and do some of this training. Now, what's interesting about the Militia Act of 1855 is that the sedentary militia, that's the one being called out in an emergency that you do not volunteer for. It technically stayed in effect well into the 20th century. And even though its role diminished and we went more with the active militia and the volunteers, it never actually ended on a specific date or by a legislative act or order. It just stopped being mentioned and faded away into Canadian history and obscurity. So my point from that, which is kind of interesting, is legally on paper somewhere, technically, because it was never canceled, every male citizen in Durham region could be called out for service between the ages of 16 and 60 in the case of an emergency. So that leads us to the Militia Act of 1859. And once again, this is where there's some more interest in military affairs and in the Canadian government in its own defense. And there was, in this act, they actually wanted organized militias that would then be organized into larger units. And, you know, this was a lot of public interest in this sort of stuff. A lot more people got involved. Like here's a picture here, and this is called the Awkward Squad. I believe this is from the Oshawa Museum. And this is actually the Oshawa militia being called out on a muster day once again. You can see they're just in their civilian clothing. And but it really started to gain interest, and that was also because of some of the things that were going on in the world. People wanted to be involved, you know, in their local militia, and the social aspect of it became even more important. So you had throughout the county, you had all these small little companies. You had the Oshawa Company, the Whitby, Cannington, etc. And with the Militia Act of 1859, they wanted to really put those and form those into a more organized structure, have them train together on these muster days, give them some standardization, and that was what it was all about. But for the people who were actually involved with it, it led to some great socialization in those times. Like here in Oshawa, on the Kingston Highway, that was a road that was built between York, now Toronto, and Kingston. There was a very popular pub. Here's the Moody's Pub. And once again, they used these muster days as an opportunity to meet with each other, to make business deals, to trade, and to drink a lot of alcohol. And the pub here in Oshawa was really like a center of that during those muster days with the early formation of these companies. There was shooting days. All of a sudden it became popular to have these public events where people would you know, practice their marksmanship. And it wasn't just those in the militia. They invited civilians, and there's even some accounts of some female shooters winning some of the prizes, some ladies from the community, and they offered prizes up to $250 for the best marksman at the time, but I guess you can say marksperson, since there was everybody involved. And this really kind of raised interest in joining the militia, and not only training for those who were in the militia, but just interest in the community. So being a part of the militia, you know, was now that it's more volunteer and there's all of these public events to be involved with, it really became central to communities' identities. And here's an actual artifact from the museum. We love to talk about this one. This is a ticket to the annual volunteer ball in Whitby for the Whitby Rifle Company. And so by being a member of that company and that militia, you know, not only did you have to do your 6 days a year of training, and you were now involved in a larger community of people, and could have different social events that were sort of exclusive to being involved in that militia. So notice this ticket here. It says, on Thursday evening, February the 11th, 1864, admit the bearer and ladies. So, you know, a young militiaman having this ticket, it was his opportunity. He could bring some ladies in his community. It was a ball. It was a lot of fun, great way of connecting and reconnecting with people in your community. And that was just part of, you know, being in this new militia. So, you know, it was a lot of fun, I can imagine, and also a great way of connecting in the community. Then something really happened that shook up the local militia here, and this is before Confederation, in 1866. And here's a bit of a fantasy picture here, a painting of the Fenian raids. So the Fenians were, um, Irish nationalists. There's some here in Canada, but also in the United States. And they actually had a plan that they were going to attack Canada, hold Canada hostage, so that the Great Britain would release Ireland and allow it to be an independent nation. So this was a very scary time for a very young country. You can see that even Confederation in 1867, was kind of a push because of the threats to the nation as it was externally, and some of them, like the Fenian raids of 1866 to 1870, these were battle-hardened soldiers, many of them veterans of the American Civil War. They still had their weapons. In this picture here, it seems a little silly. They're all wearing green, and of course the British and Canadians are wearing red. That wasn't really the case. The Fenians, they did have the green IRA flags, but most of them wore, older, battered Civil War uniforms or civilian clothing, just with a green band on their arm. But this really made the government in Canada decide that it was time to get serious about defense. Home guards were established right here in Oshawa. That's, once again, it's almost like that early sedentary militia, not being part of the official militia, but getting your rifle or your shotgun and joining a home guard to protect just in case there was an invasion. And the government put a lot of money behind this. The actual militia started to drill twice a week, not just 6 days a year. And both the Home Guard and the volunteer militia, they were paid 50 cents a day. Now, that's a lot of money in 1866. So with this new reorganization, the government realized the difficulty of mobilizing all of these rural companies, getting the word out to them and mobilizing them. So they actually organized, and this is the birth of the Ontario Regiment as we know it today. They organized on the 14th of September, 1866, the 34th Battalion of Infantry. And here's actually the colors, the guidon of that original 34th Battalion. This was sewn by the ladies of Whitby for the 34th Battalion. It was the first colors or battle flag for the battalion. The battalion brought together all of the different independent companies and small companies that were throughout our region into one battalion, that they would have a standardization of drill, standardization of uniforms, training. They had concentrated training, and sort of build an identity. They would there was all the active militia again. These are volunteers. So now we're in a time where you're not told you have to be there. You actually have to volunteer for it. You get paid. And the 34th Battalion served in many battles of the Fenian raid, including the Battle of Ridgeway, and in lots of guard duty and scares of Fenian invasions of Canada, anywhere in southern Ontario all the way to Quebec. So it was really a big move for the development of the Ontario Regiment. Here's actually the very first photo we have of members of the 34th Battalion. This is from the Whitby Public Library. And you can see right there, they have the 3-4. And 34 will remain important in the development and history of the regiment right up to 2021 today, but that'll be in another talk. And these are actually members of the Whitby Rifle Company of the 34th Battalion. Here we have the 9th Company Columbus. So this is Columbus, the little town of Columbus, just north of the city of Oshawa. And you can see there on their training and muster, they have a standardization of uniforms. They have weapons. There's obviously, you see the top hats there. There's some locals, businessmen, etc., are there to get their photo taken. Here we have Cannington. So we have the Cannington Company, their standardized uniforms. And then here's the Cannington Company. This is about a decade and a half later in 1890, once again, but this that development and standardization of training and uniforms. One other thing that came out of the 34th Battalion being formed was the regimental band of the 34th Battalion. So here's actually a photo. This one is from 1890. And it shows the regimental band. This was during the concentration. In the background there, you can actually see the bell tents. So they're either at Fort Niagara on their summer training or somewhere locally here within the region. And what's really interesting about the band is in the 1950s, the Canadian Armed Forces actually stood down all of their regimental bands. But this band continued on as the Oshawa Civic Band. So the Oshawa Civic Band that you guys know now at the McLaughlin Band Shell and through our community actually shares its roots with the Ontario Regiment from 1866. And then when they were split off in the 1950s, they kept some of those regimental traditions and continue on now with over 150 years of history here in Oshawa as the Oshawa Civic Band. So the Fenian raids came and went, and here is actually the medals that we have several in our collection here at the museum that were awarded for those who did serve in the raids, either in battles or on guard duty, those who actually were stood up and had to go to defend Canada. And it's also considered the first Canadian General Service Medal. This was the first time that the government of Canada issued medals to Canadians rather than the British Empire issuing medals to our citizens. So now we have the, and here are the next colors. This is a huge development that happened just in those years after the Fenian raid. So here we have 1895, the 34th Battalion gets some new colors, as the Queen's colors here. A couple things you'll note that in the center of it, there's 34 again, but this time in Roman numerals. And for the first time ever, we have the motto of the unit, which is Fidelis et Paratus. And in Latin, that is faithful and prepared, or faithful and ready. So here we go, as early as 1895. That is becoming part of the unit's culture and heritage. And we really start to see at this period, instead of those small independent companies, people representing Columbus and Cannington and Uxbridge and Oshawa and Whitby, they're starting to really identify themselves as the 34th Battalion and as a county unit, regardless of where you come from. And I really love this picture. This one's from the Oshawa Museum, this one here. And this is the 34th Battalion. Now we're just the beginning of the 20th century in 1910. I believe they're up in Uxbridge training. And you can see they have the standardized uniforms. But what I love about this picture is it really shows that, that our local units, our militias that we're developing into these military units are very reflective of their communities. So here you can see, if you look at this picture here, you see the first row, maybe it's not very large on your screen. There wasn't a cadet corps or anything like that at this time. I can't imagine that any of those boys up front are older than 13 or 14 years old that are joining the militia. Also, you can see in the photo, it's not just English and Irish and Scottish or American settlers. We can see that there's members of our Indigenous community that are part of the 34th Battalion throughout this photo. And also, they're starting to have more and more of an identity of being a group together. The officers you can't see here, they've actually traded that 3-4, the 34th, for a new badge. And here we have it, is in 1912, this was made the badge of the 34th Battalion. We have, again, Fidelis et Paratus, but for the first time, we see the cat. And this is actually a cat sitting on a pillow, not the cat that you see currently in our badge, but also notice that the 3-4 is still there for the 34th Battalion. So some of these traditions, these icons and things that would later become, synonymous with the Ontario Regiment were slowly being developed, and it didn't matter from which independent company or which part of the region you were from. You are now part of this, one large unit, definitely sort of like a brotherhood, and in shared traditions and shared experiences. So this really led the 34th Battalion and the region of Durham to be well prepared for the troubles that would happen in the 20th century. So in this whole time, in this whole talk, I've been talking about, the dangers of being in British North America, home defense, but, in the early part of the 20th century, something's going to happen that is going to put Canada as a nation into international affairs. That's going to have to make these young volunteers, not just come out for summer camp or come out for the dances and the fun of being involved in the regiment, but it's going to make them put on uniforms, go overseas, and be involved in some terrible conflicts on a global scale. But through those 200 years of development, being part of that community, being ready for defense, really positioned the people of the region of Durham for the huge conflagrations that were about to break out. And this final picture here, I believe this is from the RMG's collection. We can see one of Durham Region's battalions marching down Simcoe Street in 1914, getting on trains to head to the First World War. And the region of Durham, disproportionate to its population across Canada, actually raised 2 full battalions for the effort of the First World War. And next time the Ontario Regiment comes up, I'll continue on from here and how people from the region of Durham, the 34th Battalion, the First World War battalions, and then eventually the Ontario Regiment really got involved in international affairs beyond our shores. So anyways, I hope you liked that. It was, an overview only, really to look at, what led to the development of our local regiment, some of the conditions over the last couple hundred years, the Battle of Whitby, which is very unknown. And you can find out more about this, read more in detail on this history and more of our history in our book, Fidelis Apparatus, available in the museum gift shop, online, as well as the Oshawa